Hello, Plastic Pills listeners. We're here with a very special guest and friend of the channel, Ben Burgis, who is the author of Give Them an Argument, and most recently, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the contemporary left. Make sure you check that out. It's with Zero Books. So today we're here to talk about liberty, and in particular, libertarianism. And rather than just spending an hour or two sitting there dunking on our favorite bad libertarian arguments, we decided to actually go for the gold standard by talking about a little book by Jason Brennan, which is essentially intended as an introduction to the libertarian tradition. And what I think is very interesting about this book is, unlike a lot of the polemics out there, he actually describes it as kind of an olive branch to those who don't actually like libertarianism all that much. In the intro, he talks a little bit about how he has this Democratic aunt who is hostile to everything she thinks libertarianism is about. And the book is in some ways a manual for her. It's called Libertarianism, What Everyone Needs to Know. So there's a lot of different arguments that are put forward in this book, and we'll probably get into the weeds with a lot of them. But before we dive into that, I was just thinking I wanted to hear what you guys have to say. So Ben, what are your thoughts? I know you're a huge Brennan fan.
Yeah, I mean, to put my cards on the table here, Brennan is somebody who I probably first encountered. I might have first seen him when he was writing for Bleeding Heart Libertarians, which, I mean, he might still do, but, it's been a long time. So I looked at that blog. But I think first started to be aware of who he was when he was writing a bunch of stuff, basically opposing the drive to organize adjuncts to, so they get paid a living wage and get health insurance and all that stuff. And as somebody who was in exactly that position at the time, he earned an eternal place on my shit list, because of that. As like, sort of this cartoonish figure of a very comfortable tenured professor who was opposed to efforts to get a more just deal for adjuncts and would make sort of specious arguments about how there are other things that you could do with the money and blah, blah, blah. But I mean, I do. So that said, right. I mean, I do really I feel great dislike for him in my heart as a human being because of that. And also, some of the other stuff that I've read by him, I've often found a lot of the ways that he argues to be very smug and very glib, as far as characterizing like lefty arguments that he's opposed to. And, none of that makes me feel any more warmly towards him. That said, I do think that in some ways, like this is like grading on a curve of libertarian books. I mean, this is actually kind of okay in some ways. Like Brennan is the sort of person who I would most like to engage with on these issues because even though, I mean, I will say right at the outset, I found a lot of the consequentialist economic arguments that he makes in this book, like pretty rushed and a little sloppy and way too a priori. But he's also like a philosophically sophisticated defender of libertarianism who's alive to at least some of the problems and ambiguities about the things that he wants to argue for. And he's certainly steeped in like my preferred way of doing philosophy and presenting his arguments, so, and he's also like a pretty smooth writer. I mean, this is a pretty quick read. So, like considering like all of my biases against Brennan, like I'm not too angry about having had to read this book.
Yeah. One of the things that I like about the text, and I do like the text as an expository piece, is that it is pitched at surprisingly high level of aesthetic readability, right? You can disagree with the arguments, but you're never going to be sitting there wondering what exactly he's trying to argue at any given time, which you sometimes feel when you're reading, the Jacques Derridas of the world or whatever, right?
I think it's kind of worth saying that, like, the fact that it's an introductory text and the way it's organized, I think both helped and hurt the book to some extent, because and it's worth mentioning for the audience too, because I don't think we were clear. I think the book is written in this unique way, which is actually a series from Oxford University Press called like What Everyone Needs to Know. And like if you go to the Oxford website, you can find a bunch of other ones that aren't on philosophical topics. Like there's one about like whatever medical science and pandemics and like, you know, India, and it'll be like what everyone needs to know, like a really broad topic of like a broad range of academic topics. And this one just happens to be the libertarianism one. And the way it's written, right, is like along these just over 100 questions. So like, you know, you'll get like, what is libertarianism? Are libertarians liberals? Is libertarianism a radical view, right? And then like it's organized by chapters. So like you'll have chapters about human nature and ethics, right? Like do libertarians believe that everyone should be selfish? And then like questions about democracy and civil rights. And I think you get the point. And I think that that's like really good for kind of like going through the book. And I think Brennan even says at the beginning of the book that it's purposely written in such a way that you don't actually have to read the whole thing, right? So he's like, you can go, and if you're just curious about one of those questions, you know, you can just go and have a look and see what he has to say about it. And I think he does do a good job of knocking down a lot of like the really cringy libertarianism arguments, right? Like, you know, a few times reading the book, it made me think of, I think someone that both Ben and Matt debated, that's Stefan Molyneux. And I was like, Stefan Molyneux would actually probably do pretty well to read this book and see like that his cringy take on libertarianism is really unsophisticated and like bad. I guess it would fall under what Brennan calls hard libertarianism, as opposed to, you know, a classical liberalism. And then I think he calls himself like a neoclassical liberal, which is kind of interesting. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I think like one of the things that was a little bit disappointing reading the book was that like some of the more meaty issues, the parts that I wanted to see like a more robust defense. So for example, you know, he talks a few times about like, why do libertarians oppose the welfare state, or what do they think about economic inequality? And he says some things that hopefully we'll get into talking in detail about, but I think because of the format of the book, like his defenses of those things, because they ended up being limited to like a few paragraphs, or like even, or maybe at best, like maybe 5-6 pages. So it was like he would say things and kind of defend them, but then I would just be disappointed because I really wanted a steel man, even though I am, like Ben and Matt, probably somewhat hostile towards libertarianism.
I've encountered a lot of libertarians who will say things like, under ideal conditions, you would never have crony capitalism because the market isn't supposed to work this way. And my response is they actually sound like a lot of tankies I know who will say things like, well, it wasn't real communism isn't supposed to look this way. In practice, it was going to be very different. We'll get it right at one point. And this is where I say to both the Stalinists and the libertarians that we need to be good dialecticians and recognize that, no, this is actually what it looks like when you have unbridled capitalism. Naturally, firms are going to use their market power to try to influence the state to pass policies that are beneficial to them. There's simply no historical evidence I can see that can testify to a point where they haven't done that, right? Any situation I can think of, that's what large enough firms will try to do for obvious economic reasons, right? So this idea that we could have something like a truly free market under capitalist conditions that conforms to the libertarian paradise just streams to me like a historical impossibility, at least if we look at the case studies going forward. And while I'm absolutely willing to say that government bears some responsibility for that, of course, it takes two to tango. And one of the things that's frustrating is that they'll, of course, never look at the market side of things when it comes to crony capitalism. This is true of PragerU also, that released a video on crony capitalism. It's always the state's fault, right? Never, these large firms. One of the things I wanted to say about Brennan that's interesting is twofold, right? One is that sometimes he is willing to be far more consistent on certain points than many other online libertarians, as Ben would put it, that we know. On the immigration issue, he says, look, if you're opposed to state intervention in the lives of people, that means you can't have something like a strong border. In fact, you might not be able to have any border at all, right? Since interference with people's mobility rights, whether they're American, Mexican, Canadian, Martian, you name it, right? So I do appreciate that, right? That he's willing to kind of bite the bullet in that respect. Sometimes that leads to positions, though, that many people on the left will be very hostile to. And I have a begrudging respect for him for being willing to bite those bullets as well, since I think even a lot of conventional liberals wouldn't want that. And a very good example that isn't present in this book, but actually in his text Against Democracy, where, rather like Hayek of yore, he says, look, why do you presuppose that a liberal society would need to be democratic in some way, shape, or form, right? Maybe we could actually do better than democracy, which is also something that comes up in that book. But before we kind of delve into the weeds here, I just figured we should talk about this particular section, since I think this is really at the heart of the book. So in the first of these kind of numbered sections, he says libertarianism is a political philosophy, which is in itself is telling. It's not an economic outlook. He defines it as a political philosophy. But in terms of what they advocate, he says, and I think many of us will take issue with this, libertarians advocate, and this is italicized, radical tolerance. Libertarianism is a demanding doctrine. It demands that we mind our own business, even though most of us would rather not. In a free society, quote unquote, some of us will choose to follow traditional lifestyles, others will choose new ways of living. Some will choose tight-knit communities, some will choose communes, some will choose a life alone. Some will be wicked, some will be virtuous. So long as a person lives in peace and respects others' liberty, she may live her life as she chooses. Libertarians say, live and let live, as Paul McCartney would put it. So I think that's a good kind of jumping off start point for our broader discussion about these themes. I personally think that there's deep problems with this, particularly in this kind of propertarian elements, since I'm not really sure you can have a tolerant society and have propertarianism. But before I dive into that, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I do just want to say, like, I agree with you, right? It's to his credit that he's consistent on the immigration issue, although that is one place where he's there is like one of his habits in writing this that like did annoy me a little bit that came up, which is his tendency to either attribute his views to libertarians with no qualifiers or attribute his views to many libertarians, and not really admit, that there are many prominent libertarians who disagree, right? So he mentions like Ron Paul, several times over the course of the book as evidence of the growing popularity of libertarianism. I don't know exactly when this book was written. I know it was during the Obama administration. So probably the, Ron Paul's 2012, run for president, is a, I think my sense is that was something that had happened recently, when this was written, but, he mentions Paul to show the popularity of libertarianism several times, but, Ron Paul is extremely anti-immigration, like to the point of advocating the amending the Constitution to get rid of birthright citizenship, so that you can't have so-called anchor babies in the U.S. coming over, when their parents come over, as undocumented immigrants from Mexico. Or Murray Rothbard, who I think is somebody he mentions in there, had a is a extremely prominent libertarian thinker who had anti-immigration views and had these.
And was a racist. Let's just be clear.
Yeah,
certainly by the end it was
for sure, right? Like, I mean, Rothbard in a lot of ways was like a, smarter and he's a better writer, but I mean, in a lot of ways he's sort of a proto-Molyneux. And yeah, Rothbard had these very Molyneux-esque sort of explanations of why it was actually okay to restrict immigration, and how maybe even libertarian principles meant that you should restrict immigration because taxpayers own the state in some sense. So it's like really their private property rights that, they can't have people come trespassing, which is a very tortured explanation. And I think to give Brennan credit where credit's due, I think like put, Murray Rothbard or Ron Paul or Stephen Molyneux in a room with Jason Brennan and to argue about immigration. And I don't doubt that like Brennan would like tear all of their rationalizations to shreds. But also it just seemed like, I don't know, like, especially because in some places he'll acknowledge the existence of intra-libertarian differences, but then like in other places he really doesn't want to. Or like another one that really bothered me along the same lines that I know I mentioned to you guys messages before this was about civil rights, that he says that, he brings up civil rights and, Jim Crow and all that stuff, several times, throughout the book. And then like he never quite like grapples with the fact that there is this like super obvious libertarian objection to civil rights legislation that like was actually Like, is the reason, for example, that Ron Paul's son, Rand Paul, told Rachel Maddow infamously when he was running for Senate the first time that he would have voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because it told private business owners, what they could do with their own property, and there's a sort of weird passage where Brennan kind of grapples with the issue, and he sort of says, well, from a libertarian perspective, there's at least this prima facie right to do it with, to engage in private discrimination, but here's a problem, so maybe private discrimination can't be allowed, which is great, but it's like I don't know, if you're going to do like the introduction to libertarianism, you should at least admit that hard libertarians disagree with you about this, and in fact some not very hard libertarians like Rand Paul disagree with you about that, and some like people who are like quasi-conservative, like people who were very influential in the libertarian movement like Barry Goldwater disagreed with you about this. And so all of which is just to say that like a lot of times it seems to me that he's attributing that like anything that sort of makes libertarians sound good to liberals, he'll sort of attribute that version of libertarianism to libertarianism in general, without doing the thing that I think would have been a little bit more intellectually honest and awkward, which is acknowledging that lots of libertarians have found libertarian reasons to be on the wrong side of these issues. And like, especially like in that civil rights case, I mean, yeah, it's to his credit that as a neoclassical liberal or whatever he wants to call himself, he's willing to accept that non-libertarian reasons overwhelm his libertarian principles in this case. But also it seemed a little bit awkward and like mumbly, that he's like not quite coming to grips with the fact that he has very unlibertarian reasons for taking that position. It's not that libertarian principles are telling him, to support mandatory integration laws. It's that he's willing to let the libertarianism take a hit. So that's just one thing that bothered me.
Yeah, I had many of the same difficulties as you. I mean, one of the things that I think aged particularly poorly in the book, just empirically, was he cites the Tea Party movement charitably as kind of a proto-libertarian movement that we should keep an eye on since they're advancing many ideas that he likes. And then, circa 2016, when he's complaining about Trump, a lot of that seems to disappear without so much as a word, right? And many of us who are a little bit more critical of the American political right might have said, well, did you really think the Tea Party movement was going to wind up becoming a bastion of libertarian thought and advocacy for personal freedom and open borders? Might have been a little bit naive there. But as to the more fundamental point, I do think, like you said, it's a well-written book. I definitely think he's trying to polish the libertarian tradition up to make it more palatable, as he says, to people who might be skeptical of it, like his Democratic aunt. And that's all well and good, right? We all engage in polemics and dogmatics to try to advocate for our positions. But at certain points, I think there's actually a pretty brazen tension in his work where he does underplay too much some of the uglier sides of libertarian doctrine. One that particularly offended me is in the very first paragraph, he talks about how libertarians are for a kind of radical equality, liberal radical equality, as it were. And his argument for that, which fair enough, is that, look, nobody should be allowed to impose their vision of the good life upon you. Everyone's vision of the good life should be considered equally according to the law, even if they're not necessarily equal in themselves or equal in terms of their virtue. And yeah, fair enough, right? Except that there are a long line of libertarian thinkers going back to Ludwig von Mises, or at least libertarian, proto-libertarian thinkers, who've always insisted fundamentally on the inequality of human beings. Von Mises and Ayn Rand had this famous exchange where von Mises said, you have, the audacity or the bravery, I can't remember exactly the term, to tell the masses what no one else wants to tell them, which is that you're inferior, right? And all the benefits that you've accrued, you owe to men who are better than you, right? And, you see Rand make reference to that all the time, with her description of people as parasites or second-handers relative to the few creative individuals in a capitalist society who've actually done everything, right? And I do wish he had spent quite a bit more time engaging with this much uglier side, much less egalitarian side to libertarianism, particularly since post-2012, when he wrote the book, we've seen a lot more of that come to the fore in online spaces, where it's almost become kind of a joke, where if somebody says they're a libertarian, your immediate thought process will go, oh, are you a libertarian, or are you actually just an alt-right kind of personality who doesn't like woke people? And as or as using this as a convenient label. I don't know what you guys think. But.
Both of you, I think, are identifying like this sort of tension in what is like the normative motivation for Brennan, I guess. So like I think it's what's interesting to me is, right, like the position he ascribes to himself, neoclassical liberal. He says it shares many of the same things as classical liberalism, but what separates it is that it's has an explicit foundational concern with social justice, right, which he defines as concerns with distributive justice, like so a la Rawls, right? So like, how do we make sure that people have opportunities to like fulfill to work with their the necessary conditions to express their freedom and live a good life? So I think like what's interesting is it seems like there's like he is kind of leaning on classic libertarian normative motivation, which is just this explicit concern with like liberty, right, and not being interfered with. But then social justice is more of like a consequentialist concern. So like it just seems like the neoclassical position he's working with has a when it's convenient, like he'll lean on like the libertarian, the more like I guess pure or hard libertarian reason. But then in other circumstances he'll talk about the need for social institutions that are going to benefit the most number of people, right? And so he'll use I think the example of open borders, right, is something like the main thing is a concern with social justice and like distributive justice, right? So, I mean, it was just, I guess, strange that like that tension seemed to come up depending on what kind of topic he was looking at, and I guess I'm curious what you guys thought about that.
Yeah, so that is extremely interesting. Like there were lots of passages where he does suggest some, even though he says he's not a hard libertarian, which at the very least means that he doesn't believe in absolute property rights, that can't give way to anything else, any competing considerations or any circumstances. But there are all these passages where he does sound like a hardish libertarian. He'll say things like, "Oh, look at all these rights that people have that can't be sacrificed for these other goals," and he'll list off the other goals, and he'll even include like economic efficiency as one of those goals that that people's rights can't be sacrificed for. But then in other passages, he says. He has this like fairly consequentialist way of understanding like what property rights even are in the first place, that that they have, that they arise out of social conventions, and people don't have a reason to accept those conventions if they're not going to benefit enough in the long term from them. So I think there is I think there's for sure some tension there. I mean, I think that the stuff that Matt's talking about like leaving people free to pursue their conception of the good life does get at one of the things that I found most frustrating about it, which also goes to what you're saying, Victor, because like the thing about consequentialist arguments is that they're actually much harder to make than like in principle or deontological arguments, right? You can sort of say, like you can kind of give an argument in a couple paragraphs that something would violate the categorical imperative or the non-aggression principle or whatever, and like that actually might be an okay argument, whereas consequentialist arguments are, for reasons that Brennan himself gestures at some points in the text, incredibly more difficult, because you don't just like to make a serious consequentialist argument for something. It's not good enough to just sort of look at, okay, one sort of respect in which it might play out, in terms of like one factor, because decisions always have all kinds of intended and unintended, consequences, which he emphasizes where that's convenient. But then his consequentialist arguments are always so simplistic. They tend to just be very like, not incorporate very many dimensions of how things might play out. And he doesn't even really seem to consider, a lot of the consequentialist arguments that might take someone from his goals to very non-libertarian conclusions. So like an obvious one, and maybe this goes back to Matt's point about how this was written several years back and, like in a very different political landscape in some ways. And so
if I could just pause you there, Ben, because I think it is important to situate this in context. one of the things that he foregrounds in this book that maybe isn't as politically relevant today, that I definitely think is an olive branch to the political left, is his concern for international peace. And he's quite implicitly scathing towards the Bush administration for mobilizing conservative support for the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, which he thinks is fundamentally wrong. And he does try to kind of coax you into buying into this, sometimes convincingly, I think, by saying, look, a genuine libertarianism would never support something like these kinds of interventions, right? So very, very different world than our 2016 post-Trump COVID kind of universe. It seems like forever ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, like, as you said, the Tea Party was a thing back then. And it's really like become a distant memory now. I would argue because it was always just a branding exercise. Like I think actually one of the most perceptive, not somebody whose politics are my politics, but, one of the most perceptive comments about this I remember was actually Jon Stewart on The Daily Show when he was interviewing Ron Paul. And he said, look, you're the real thing as far as the Tea Party goes. Most Tea Partiers are just the moral majority in a tri-corner hat. Which is exactly right, that it was always just sort of a branding exercise for basic conservatism, whereas Brennan thought that it really showed, the sort of popularity of libertarian principles. But also, and this is something I was kind of reminding myself of like several times while I was reading it, he's writing it before that first Bernie Sanders campaign and the rise of DSA and the squad and Congress and all of that stuff, right? Which I think does make a difference, because I do think, to be fair to Brennan, that there are things that if he'd written it today, he probably would have grappled with that, he maybe didn't need to, because they just weren't as much on people's minds and political discussions in 2013 or whatever this was. But like, I think a couple of those like really do like show how, like, yeah, there are some like pretty obvious ways that you can make consequentialist arguments given his stated goals for very anti-libertarian conclusions. Do you want to give everybody a chance to pursue the good life? Well, are people more or less likely to quit their job to spend a year, living on a tighter budget and finally writing that novel if they don't have to worry that losing their job means they don't have health insurance? Are people more or less likely to go to school and get the training that they need for a new career if college is tuition free and paid for by progressive taxation, etc. Right? Like there are all sorts of obvious ways that you can get from everybody should be able to pursue the good life as they wish to very non-libertarian conclusions about economics, and especially because Brennan himself, I mean, this whatever sort of. Yeah, I agree. It's like an under-theorized thing in the book, like at least in this book, exactly how neoclassical liberalism is supposed to be different from hard libertarianism. But it does seem relatively clear that one way it's supposed to be different is that he is kind of acknowledging, even though he kind of wants to have it both ways at certain points of the book, that property rights are not like bodily autonomy rights, that that redistributing money really is not like redistributing sexual partners or whatever, that they and once you've admitted that, then if you still want to end up in libertarian places, your consequentialist arguments better be airtight, and I just didn't think they were.
Yeah, I think, doesn't he say at one point that his view is a presumption of liberty as opposed to some sort of sanctity of liberty, that it's like something that cannot be violated. Yeah, that's right. I think he has a question where it's like, when can liberty be violated for libertarians, right? And he says it's a prima facie presumption that liberty is the goal, but there's always going to be circumstances, right, where that can maybe be contradicted. And specifically, right, his normative motivation is like what he calls social justice. So I guess he thinks, I think what he's trying to do is show that the best way to achieve social justice, right, is obviously through these libertarian means that respect freedom and free and free economic activity. But I think one of the examples, right, when he's making these sort of consequentialist arguments for why like liberty and open markets, they seem to stand and fall on just like empirical claims, right? Like there's a bunch of chapters, one where he talks about that I found particularly unconvincing, at least, was like, are libertarians trying to protect big business? And he says something, he makes this empirical claim, right, by what seemed like cherry-picked examples. But again, as I said at the beginning, because a lot of his answers to these questions were kind of brief, it's like he didn't give a very robust defense. He just kind of would say, so like, he would say, actually, like, more government power is what leads to more corporate power, right? He has this whole thing where he keeps on, like, kind of harping on this point that if you look through the history, you can see that, like, government power just ends up picking and choosing corporate winners, right? And, like, that's actually the thing that leads to crony capitalism, is, like, government. And I mean, it just kind of depends on the empirical claim. And I found myself thinking that that's true, that that's happened sometimes. Like, clearly government decides to subsidize corn crops, and he talks about that big Arthur Daniels Midland, I think is the company that he brings up a few times, that they have protected. So it's true, but it just seemed very like a very weak argument, because it's like he's picking examples that has happened. I agree. I think most leftists are also agree that that's a bad thing when that happens. But to generalize from that and say, well, because it's happened in these cases, that means government in principle leads to more corporate power, seemed like a stretch to me.
And it's not even just that it's the state's fault. It's that, like, the solution is really unclear, at least to me, right? He says, well, the way to stop, corporations from buying politicians is to have, like, a really minimal libertarian state, so there's nothing to buy. Is like, okay, but, like, what's the game plan here, right? Like, how is it that you're going to continue to have these extreme concentrations of wealth, but also not have the wealthy people, use that influence, politically to get themselves, special favors? I mean, like, it just seems like, well, we just have to go through some period where everybody's virtuously abstaining from that. And this is something I would also argue, like, really undermines what he says in chapter 7, when he argues that, well, there's really no reason to be an egalitarian, that anything that looks like the sort of moral force of egalitarianism is captured by, like, a few other considerations, like welfarism, that, like, as long as the people at the bottom have enough, then, like, there's no, there's no remaining reason to, to care about inequality. But this is a reason, right, that if there's wildly unequal distribution of economic resources, there's going to be a wildly unequal distribution of political influence. And so, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's a very, like, I actually think in, like, much the same way that the tankies think that you can have a state that doesn't have, like, legal protections of, individual rights, whatever, but it's not gonna, you're not gonna get these horrors. I think believing that you can have, like, dramatic inequality without, without the people at the top, calling in favors from the state just seems extremely naive. Not to mention, of course, the sort of traditional socialist argument, which is that that the same process is going to play out at the workplace. That if you have that if some people have way more than others, then some people are going to be in a bargaining position to get other people to submit to their will, as bosses, as bosses in the workplace. And neither of those reasons to care about inequality are really things that he grapples with at all in the book.
I don't even think he mentions or addresses monopolies. I was kind of waiting for him to try to talk to, like, say something. I mean, unless I missed it, but I don't remember him at all saying that there was some like intrinsic reason related to libertarian moral arguments that would, like, prevent, I guess, just, like, more competition. But I mean, I don't know, empirically that just seems really unconvincing. And
I will also say, like, that, like, when the extent to which he addresses it, is, like you say, he just keeps on saying, well, it's because, like, government action, helps, big businesses consolidate or provides incentives, for big business consolidation. But I also think it's, like, really telling about the limits of his concern here, because, like, the whole thing is, like, from a perspective that assumes that, like, really the objection to libertarianism just serving the interests of business is that it would serve the interests of big business. The people who, like, sure, let's say for the sake of argument, libertarian policies would result in much less consolidated, enterprises that you'd have, that like ownership would be much more dispersed. Well, that's good news for small business owners, but it's not at all obvious that helps workers much. I mean, if anything, wages tend to be lower at smaller businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the historical arguments that I typically make with regard to this crony capitalism point is that we've never seen a libertarian paradise, but we have seen plutocracy for 3,000 or 4,000 years at this point, right? So it's a much more recognizable form of government than anything that they're putting forward.
Yeah, and he says like things like, like when he's arguing that like left-wing policies are going to make the problem worse and lead to more corporate consolidation, he says, well, the moderate left in the shape of the Democratic Party has been in power, but then he never seems to do the parallel thing and say like, well, hold on. So haven't libertarian preferences been at least as much implemented, through like deficit hawk conservatives, as certainly as you can say, like any kind of robustly left-wing preferences have been through moderate Democrats. I mean, like Ronald Reagan, when he was running for president, gave interviews to Reason magazine where he said, libertarianism is the core of conservatism. And of course, somebody as smart as Brennan could list off, like spend a couple pages listing off all the respects in which that's bullshit as far as like Reagan's policies and conservatism in general. But like also, there are no past Democratic presidents who said that the core of liberalism was socialism.
Yeah, very true. Well, I want to move on briefly to the kind of deontological dimensions of his argument, since I think that's what a lot of us want to bite our teeth into. Since, as Ben mentioned, the kind of consequentialist arguments he makes about economic efficiency, we could be here all day going back and forth with examples on that. Maybe we will in a sequel episode. But a lot of the stuff that he says at the opening of the book as a kind of set of axioms that libertarians take to be true, or at least presume to be true, to use Victor's language, might actually sound very attractive to people on the political left. And I'll just run through them very quickly, right? Radical respect, radical equality, radical peace, responsibility, not radical responsibility, strangely, and then finally radical freedom. It's almost strange how often that word is invoked, since you can go through anything by a contemporary socialist and they won't use the term radical as often as that. Victor and I kind of joke around about that every now and then. But look, my argument is, in principle, I'm willing to grant him this kind of axiomatic preference for moral equality and individual freedom. We can argue about that from a meta-ethical standpoint, and if we want to get really into the weeds, that would be extremely important, but let's just give him that for right now. The question that I would have would be, is a libertarian system of the type he describes the best system for securing individual liberty and moral equality? And my contention would be that it's not. And the contention that I would make about this is that almost any socialist, particularly 21st century, is going to have an extreme degree of respect, at least for bodily autonomy. And Ben, you and I talked about that a little bit last week, right? Most socialists and leftists today will think that it's very important, for instance, that women have a right to choose whether or not to have an abortion. Most of us are anti-war on drugs. Most of us tend to put a lot of weight on the importance of mobility rights, particularly for migrants, right? So we would all agree with Brennan on this one. I think the disagreement would come on the possessive individualist point. This idea that what's important to freedom and equality isn't just bodily autonomy, but property rights. And what's interesting is he shifts gears later in the book when defending property rights from the kind of deontological language he uses earlier in the text to a much more consequentialist kind of perspective. Which isn't what you see some people like Nozick do, where he says, look, we want property rights because they enhance economic efficiency. It looks after the poor. And I think that one of the reasons for this shift in orientation is precisely because Brennan knows that it's very difficult, as Ben said, to move from this notion of individual freedom, moral equality, and as it relates to bodily autonomy, to a very strict concept of property rights. Try, though many libertarians have, right?
Yeah. And I think, again, it's especially hard to shift to that. Yeah. I mean, because of course, right. Like we were talking about last week, if you try to run like the Nozick, kind of argument, which, by the way, I'm still like, every time I think back to what you mentioned, that still makes me laugh, that like that Nozick buried the sort of like big obvious objection to his defense of existing property rights in a footnote. That's
give him credit where credit's due. At least he was aware that it was an objection, right?
Fair enough, but like the book's several hundred pages long, and it all seems to be defending one thing, and then you say, well, actually, none of this quite applies to the real world, and you put it in a footnote. It's okay. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, I think that so this is a big problem for that sort of in principle, hard libertarians, as he puts it in there, that like, they'll try to move from, and even he kind of tries to do this at some point, right? Because he does like using metaphors with bodily autonomy to ground economic liberties at different points in the book. But certainly when the hard libertarian tries to go from bodily autonomy to ownership and external property, I mean, it always ends up being kind of a weird mess. Because there's just no obvious principle for getting from one to the other. I mean, like all the things that that libertarians can try to say, you're the first person to see something, you're the first person to claim something, you mix your labor with it, whatever. All of these would be like okay rules for a society to adopt, in a circumstance of lots of unclaimed land, and you need some way to decide how to recognize freeholding claims, and these would all be like
a risk game. You know what I mean? You all have your little pieces, and you put them wherever on the map you want, and then everybody starts from there, right?
Yeah, exactly. So like under those circumstances, like imagining people like pioneers in the Western frontier, but without the genocide element. Like I have like under those circumstances, all of these would be okay systems. Maybe, but the idea that any one of them has some sort of like principled, like deontological status, that this is just like, this is where you get your natural rights to property, like just seems hopelessly arbitrary. And which is why, to his credit, Brennan doesn't really try to do that, right? He tries to give a sympathetic hearing to hard libertarians who do argue that way. But then, like, at least in those passages where he's being most precise, he says, property is a social convention. It has to, here are all these reasons why it's a good social convention to have, but it's a social convention. And a lot of those reasons are just reasons that would just apply to any stable, predictable, distributive system. That it allows people to make plans because they have firm expectations about what's going to happen, that no contracts are going to be honored, all that stuff. All that stuff would be true for like any economic system with stable, well-enforced rules. Like that doesn't tell you anything about why we should have the kind of property rights that we have under capitalism. And otherwise he's just giving a consequentialist argument. And when he's giving those consequentialist arguments, it seems like the way that he likes to do it is by saying, well, look how much more sure, having access to money is a kind of positive liberty, blah, blah, blah. But, poor people are better off under capitalism, than under alternatives. So, so then it's good to have capitalist property rights. But it's so like, it's so half-assed. I mean, it's just like, what is he really comparing that to? He's comparing it to pre-capitalist forms of society, feudalism, hunter-gatherer societies, whatever, in which case certainly no Marxist is going to disagree with him, or he's comparing it to Stalinism, I guess. But I think I would argue that even there he's severely simplifying the historical record. I think the balance sheets of what's been good and bad about capital C communist societies is more complicated than what he's suggesting. But also, like, okay, fair enough. Like, he could say reasonably, all right, Ben, you want to say here's like a kind of like radical democratic socialism that has never actually existed. And, you want me to compare capitalism to that, but that's an unfair comparison, blah, blah, blah. And we could have a whole argument about that and how that relates to, the crony capitalism stuff Matt was really raising earlier. But
you did write a book in response to G.A. Cohen, which I have not read, I should say. Why Not Capitalism? Response to Cohen's Why Not Socialism. So yeah, maybe in a future episode we'll go through that. But
no, that'd be fun. I like that. But like I was just gonna say, like on a much more basic level, like, okay, fair enough. So let's just, for the sake of argument, let's take alternative, more democratic forms of socialism that have never been tried off the table and say that's not even what we're going to worry about for the sake of comparison. Well, the range of existing societies doesn't just include East Germany, feudal Europe, and modern capitalism. It also includes like advanced social democracies, which certainly score way higher on most of, I would argue on most of the criteria he claims to care about than the far more laissez-faire, kind of capitalism that we have here.
It's funny. He actually mentions a couple of times like Switzerland and Canada, like as examples of countries that score higher on the freedom index from like whatever that libertarian think tank, which I thought was kind of funny because they all have some form of robust social safety net. I mean, not like the social democracies of Scandinavia, but still, certainly better
compared to the U.S.
Exactly. But this also, I mean, kind of made me think this discussion about like the role of consequentialist reasoning in general in like political argumentation, and like sort of to be fair to Brennan's sort of like awkward back and forth between using like that deontological sort of hard libertarian reasoning versus consequentialist social justice informed reasoning. And like, I mean, I think we see it on like among socialists kind of analogously in the sense that like, if you think that like socialism has to be where the state or somehow collectively the means of production are controlled, but there might be a lot of consequentialist reasons where we think that it might be useful to be a market socialist or something like that. And it's like right, like when it's convenient, it makes sense because. And I don't know this. I don't want to take the discussion off track, but I mean it does. I find myself when I read this and other times when this question comes up, I remember just being an undergrad philosophy student, right, and thinking about like, well, isn't consequentialism just the thing that matters like the most? Because I feel like if this is true, I mean, a couple of times reading Brennan's book, I mean, rarely was I like convinced by the empirical claims he was making about the consequences of markets and individualism. But like I did think to myself, like as sort of like what informs my own moral outlook towards the world. Like if this was true, I think I would have to support it. Like in a few cases anyway, right? Like I don't have some kind of ideological or I don't know if the word deontological would even apply, but I don't have some kind of attachment to things having to be government run. Like if it's going to give me the outcome, then I'm going to support it, right? And there's a good reason, but like I don't think that it's going to give that outcome. So
I just wanted to intervene there in 1 second and talk about his history as a bleeding heart, so-called libertarian. One of the interesting things about bleeding heart libertarianism is it was very influenced by the thinking of John Rawls, who famously near the end of his life declared himself to be either for a property-owning democracy or some kind of liberal socialism, which is what I self-endorse. But anyway, long story short, Brennan kind of makes the argument that actually we could endorse libertarianism and the libertarian approach to property rights on Rawlsian principles, because he says, look, Rawls doesn't say we have to be attached to this or that distributive order. Right? What we need to do is be attached to a distributive order that maximizes the benefit of the least well off. Right? Sorry, any particular empirical distributive order. And he says, if it turns out empirically that a libertarian approach to property rights does make the least well off better off than any other competitor, then we have good Rawlsian reasons to adopt it. Which was an intriguing argument. I don't see him make it that often any longer. I think because it's so empirically contestable. I mean, you can think about the Scandinavian example Ben brought up as just a huge counter argument against that. But at least it was a kind of creative way of trying to spin things in a manner that might be palatable to some progressives, right?
I find in general, I find those like libertarian like country freedom indexes hilarious because like libertarians, and Brennan does this all the time in the book, will treat that as if it's just like this like really clear, like uncontroversial, like factual starting point for discussions.
You're just objectively more free.
Yeah, it's like, oh, these are the countries that are objectively more free than these other countries. It's like, the hell does that mean? Like you'd have like all like there are even by libertarian standards, there are a zillion different factors by which you could, evaluate countries, and then you have to come up with a way to weigh them, and like whatever formula the Cato Institute has come up with, for deciding, which countries are more free is extremely opaque. And in some cases just hilarious. Like they have like whether like whether there are regulations against like raw milk is something that comes up like as one of the criteria by which they use to evaluate rank countries by freedom, but like whether abortion is legal isn't, right? So it's such a weird eccentric thing, you know, like and it's just like taking this like whatever sort of mixture of 20 factors and weighted in whatever way makes sense to, you know, like whatever intern at the Cato Institute is like has been tasked with crunching these numbers. The idea is like, oh, okay, well, fair enough. So that, you know, economic freedom, there we go. All we have to do is look at the list, especially when, as Victor said, he keeps on referencing all of these countries that are much more social democratic than the United States as being economically freer. And it's like, well, now I get real confused, you know, because like if all that's compatible with economic freedom, then I no longer understand what I disagree with this guy about.
Well, to be fair to him, he does actually point out that despite the fact that libertarian ideas are very popular in the United States, as Victor pointed out, isn't not at all close to being the libertarian paradise that many people want it to be. And he does, you know, highlight some of the examples of this. You know, one of the most obvious ones is the fact that the United States, land of the free, you know, New Hampshire's slogan, live free or die, is also the country with far and away the highest incarceration rate in the world, right? Just thousands of people per million incarcerated in U.S. jails. That's certainly not the case in many other countries, including some where you would expect the incarceration rate to be far higher than in the U.S. You know, the Cubas of the world, the Irans. Don't want to speak to North Korea since, you know, I would never trust anything that comes out of that government or China. But certainly compared to other OECD countries, you know, the Nordic states, France, Canada, etc. So it doesn't do really well on those metrics.
Yeah, no, that part's totally fair. But I mean, it's also, and I mean, obviously I'm exaggerating when I say I no longer know I mean, I know a lot of stuff I disagree with him about, but like it does though seem like if his conception of economic freedom isn't violated when you take important aspects of society outside of the market and, you know, pay for them by progressive taxation and make them free at the point of service, then like I do get a little bit fuzzier about what, you know, what economic freedom means, you know, like it and it, like certainly all of those, you know, Canada, Switzerland, never mind, you know, Norway and Sweden and Finland, you know, have done that in spades, you know, compared to the States.
You know, I had a similar experience, like, as Ben, you know, I know you, like, obviously there's lots of things to disagree with, but there's actually, like, a key moment, I think, when he's talking about inequality. I think it's question 78 when he asks, like, what do libertarians think about inequality? And he kind of says, I did select a quote here. He says, classical and neoclassical liberals hold that welfarism. So welfarism is, I guess, prioritizing the welfare of people. And then he talks about sufficientarianism, which is like the idea that you have to make sure everyone has like the sufficient means to be free, like sufficient like material resources. And then prioritarianism, right, which is like we should prioritize the worst off. So he kind of like bundles all three of these views, and he says that they capture the moral force of egalitarianism, which is what he thinks is like kind of motivating the left. And then he says, if welfarist, sufficientarian, and prioritarian goals have been met from the standpoint of social justice, egalitarianism has no remaining attraction, right? So he says, and then he says, neoclassical liberals agree that a fair and just society gives everyone a stake in that society. A just society has institutions that ensure as much as possible that everyone has the resources needed to be a free person. Still, they say the goal of a society is to make everyone well off, not to make them equal, right? So like to make everyone well off, but not necessarily equal. And I mean, reading that again, I kind of had this sensation of being like, well, I guess like that's like, I'm not going to disagree that I want that too. But I guess the question obviously is like empirically is that actually going to be achievable from the things he wants? But it is interesting that he kind of is trying to set up his argument to be, look, if I meet all these things, then like your egalitarian concern goes away. Like that's kind of like the way he's trying to structure it, which is key, I think, to the argument.
And here I think we need to be careful, right? Nozick in Anarchy, State, and Utopia has a critique of egalitarianism, which I think is kind of a caricature of what a lot of us actually want, but nonetheless is quite popular. And he runs, look, you know, if you're really committed to substantive equality, or, you know, the dreaded Petersonian equality of outcome, right? Does that mean, you know, if you have people running a race and some people have natural abilities that exceed those of others, that you should put weights in their shoes or handicap them in some way If somebody is more handsome than other people, this handsome man thought experiment, which I did think was funny, actually. Should you try to make him less attractive so that he doesn't outcompete other people in the sexual marketplace purely through morally arbitrary advantages that have to do with genetics for which he can take no credit, right? And he says, obviously, we would never want to do any of these things. Ergo, what we shouldn't be trying to aspire to is equality along any or most metrics, right? It's kind of like the Incredible problem. If anybody's seen that movie, at some point the villain in the movie says, if everyone is special, then nobody will be. That's the kind of damning world that he paints for us, right? And in responding to that, I typically say, look, I can't think of any serious egalitarian, and I'm like Ben will always say, I'm sure if we scour the internet, there'll be somebody there who says, we must be equal in every single respect, bar none. But serious egalitarians who will say we need to be equal along every single metric, right? Virtually everybody I can think of recognizes that there'll be substantial differences in personal property in a socialist society, that people's natural abilities will differ in some important respects, and that might actually be a good thing if they develop them and they can be beneficial to the rest of society. And of course, people will differ in terms of their personal virtue, right? Try though I might, I can't think of even the most dystopian scenario where sci-fi authors come up with a way of making good people evil or evil people good, right? A lot of that has to do with individual choices, personal characteristics, social environments that go beyond even just economics, et cetera, et cetera. So there will be inequalities, right, in the kind of socialist society that I would want, and I imagine Ben would want. The question is, how far should we allow economic inequalities that relate to substantial power inequities to stand? And there I think we would want to be a lot more scrupulous than Brennan is, because I think allowing substantial inequities in economic power that translates into political power isn't just wrong morally, but fundamentally actually poses serious existential problems to liberal society because of the emergence of things like crony capitalism and many of the other things that we've talked about. And I'm not sure if you guys agree, but I'm just going to put that forward as a kind of argument.
Yeah, no, I think so. I do think there are, arguments for taking equality seriously, like as like a default. That I'm not convinced that Brennan is adequately grappling with. Right. I think even in some of his arguments where, again, I'd point to, the ways that he addresses or doesn't quite address questions about racial justice as a place where he seems to get like slightly embarrassed at certain points by where libertarian principles would lead him, if taken like sufficiently seriously, both in his willingness to outlaw private sector, just discrimination for consequentialist reasons, and also in the places where he sort of says, well, okay, distributive inequality between black people and white people in the United States didn't really come about, in an immaculate way. And so maybe we could do something or other to correct it. I'm not quite sure what. Next section. And in that second place in particular, it seems to me that he is kind of granting that like inequality might be a little bit troubling in itself, that like, okay, maybe racial inequality would be okay if it just sort of happened that way, right? But like, since it didn't, it's not. But presumably he wouldn't go the other way around. He wouldn't say, well, if we just happened, let's say that if we'd let the free market chips fall where we may, for whatever reason, there'd be a little bit more racial inequality just due to whatever weird historical circumstances. Therefore, it's not okay that we have greater equality, right? The way he would when it's the other way around. So I think in that passage, it seems to me that like even he feels a little bit of a pull of egalitarianism. But I generally agree with that, right? Like, I think that nobody's really, it's even beyond the sort of Harrison Bergeron examples about the, like inequality in looks or inequality in, singing ability and, and all of that stuff. None of which is stuff that, really for the most part, leftists big, object too much. Like even on the sort of stricter like questions of economic equality, I don't know who these people are really who think that we have to have like perfect economic equality. I mean,
Again, scour the internet, you'll find someone, I'm sure.
yes, yeah, absolutely, right. I mean, Cicero said there's no position so absurd that some philosopher doesn't defend it, and for sure there's no position so absurd that someone on Reddit doesn't defend it. Like you will be able to find someone for everything, but by and large, right? Do social democrats think that? No, certainly not, right? Do like New Deal, Great Society left liberals think that? No, certainly not. Do Marxists think that? Well, Marx certainly didn't. Read Critique of the Gotham Program. He thought that in a early stage of a socialist society, you would need some material inequality for the sake of incentives. That if some people chose to work harder, or for longer hours than others, you should give them more material rewards to incentivize that. And he thought in a more advanced social society, where you had material superabundance, then the whole issue of distributive equality would just sort of be moot because everybody could take what they want. And whatever you think about that, like just bracketing any question about how realistic or well thought out any of that is, like that's certainly not a vision of absolute egalitarianism in either half. And certainly people who have like more sort of elaborate schemes of like how market socialism or participatory economics or whatever, certainly none of those people are envisioning that we'd have exact perfect distributive inequality. The issue is, are there reasons to object to like extreme inequalities? Are there reasons to think, okay, yeah, some people have a little bit more than others and whatnot, and there might be good reasons to have that, but like, have like the sort of inequalities so extreme that they would lead to some people agreeing to just standard capitalist labor contracts where they gave away their voice and their vote and the operation in exchange for having any kind of job at all, right? Like the sort of thing that, which by the way, right now, slight side note, but give me like 30 seconds on this. I do love that as we are recording this, a super pervasive right-wing talking point is in the United States is, oh my God, it's terrible that with these universal income payments because of COVID, that people, we can't find anybody to flip burgers anymore. Like every, all of these empirically, it's a little dubious, like how much truth there is to that. But like, there are certainly a lot of business owners and a lot of right-wing politicians who that's their stated belief, that it's a big problem finding enough people to flip burgers, because of the UI payments. And it's like, that just really seems like a mask off thing, because it's like, okay, well, which is it, right? Like, are you actually going to claim that people are working these jobs of their own free will? Or are you kind of admitting that you need the whip of destitution to get people to agree to work under these circumstances?
Yeah, no kidding.
Which it really seems like they're admitting in these cases. And in fact, I mean, like whether it's true or not that there is that much of a labor shortage, their stated explanation of it assumes that you need the whip of destitution to get people to agree to work at McDonald's or Walmart or wherever. But also, so like, yeah, having so much inequality that you get that in the workplace is a problem. Having so much inequality that you get inequality in political influence is a problem. Having so much inequality that you end up, having that you end up having some people just have much worse life outcomes is a problem in itself, which, like go back to the race metaphor. It's like, okay, if all you're doing is hobbling the person at the front and you're not doing anything to help people in the back, sure, maybe, that would be silly. Right. But of course the whole issue is that there are all these reasons to think that the two are not unrelated, that even if you agree with some of like Brennan's economic arguments and think that like bad incentives are created, that do, that like, so maybe maybe the effect of some of the stuff is to do more hobbling at the front than helping people at the back. Undeniably, you are helping people at the back, when you do redistribution. So yeah, I mean, like maybe this goes to Victor's point about, consequentialism. Even though, I mean, I'm certainly not willing to go all the way to pure consequentialism, in moral political philosophy. I mean, I think we could, I think, you could come up with some scenario where, you have a teensy tiny little slave class that's that's subordinate to everybody else, and much
Get the
more,
doctors to slice up their patients and redistribute their organs.
Exactly, right? So like for all of those reasons, I wouldn't go all the way to pure consequentialism, but like also I do kind of have the reaction that Victor was expressing earlier to a lot of that stuff, which is like, okay, sure, yeah, do sufficientarianism and welfarism and prioritism or whatever it is, like prioritarianism, like maybe when you put those three together, they do capture most of the reasons to care about equality. But also, I think as an empirical matter, that if you take those three things really seriously, then you can't have too much economic inequality, or it's going to mess with all three of them.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I mean, to answer to Matt's earlier point, like I do think that the point of Brennan bringing up those different isms, the prioritarianism, right, is to say that, like, obviously he's not gonna, like, people, like most leftists don't want like perfect equality, right? There's you want to make sure everyone has sufficient means and whatever, but. Sort of reading this book and this discussion, it's also reminding me of Matt and I did a podcast a while ago where we looked at Wolf's Anarchism, the In Defense of Anarchism book. I'm not sure if you ever read it, Ben, but like, I mean, the reasoning in that, like the reaction I had to that book, it was like a very like fixated on this like very strict definition of freedom, like a kind of deontological obsession with freedom. And I mean, obviously Brennan's hedging here a lot more, but it does when I think about like the tendency, I suppose, in political philosophy to get too fixated on one thing, right? I guess the left, you could accuse them of sometimes in bad versions getting too fixated on equality. Yeah, they're getting too fixated on equality, and then I don't know, libertarians too fixated on freedom, and and I think back to just why I got interested in political philosophy and political theory, which is just thinking about like those deep questions about what is the good life, and like what's the point of us living together and organizing our societies? Like, what are we actually after? And it's like freedom to me, it's like, is that like, that's not even like, it's good for something, right? Like freedom is good to do something, to like, and so. But then when you start to just get you almost reify, like it seems like some of these libertarians are like reifying freedom as if it's like this intrinsically important good. But like, really, I don't know, as a leftist with sort of consequentialist concerns about the good life, about living the good life, it's like, I'm only interested in the freedom that's going to enable me to do something that's related to like the good life, I suppose.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I don't know. I mean, maybe I think I might have slightly different intuitions about this. Like, I think that whether freedom is sort of at the at the floor as we go down to our list of concerns, whether it's all the way back down there or not, right? Like, it's certainly. And I mean, I think that's an interesting question, like how much of it's instrumental, which, a lot of Brennan's arguments are anyway, right? And how much of it is, that we value in itself. And I think I am inclined to, think that we do value in itself to some extent, although also it's incredibly ambiguous, right? There are different kinds of freedom, but I would feel really remiss if we ended the discussion without like noting that, that like one of my biggest criticisms of the book is that, is that Brennan kind of takes it for granted throughout that freedom, or at least negative freedom, he, when he's talking about positive freedom, he does understand that, like he has to make like slightly more complicated consequentialist arguments. And for all the reasons we've talked about, I'm not sold on those arguments, but put that to one side, right? He also seems to assume that negative freedom is like unambiguously associated with libertarian, policies. And I'd really hate for us to have this whole discussion without pushing back against that at least a little bit, since, I mean, for one thing, the classical Marxist objection to capitalist employment contracts is that they are coercive, that people, that given wildly unequal bargaining power, that you don't really have, that you're not really making a totally uncoerced, free decision to agree to these arrangements. And so that's one thing. But then another thing is just that, like, he keeps talking, like, he does a very typical libertarian thing throughout this book where he just constantly talks about force and violence and coercion in this way that suggests that force and violence and coercion, like, more libertarian, more economically libertarian means less force and violence and coercion. And I think that should really be questioned in a lot of ways, right? Like one of them is the way that Proudhon was talking about, when he said that property is theft, which is, I think about a lot now, because my wife and I have been riding out the pandemic, and Houghton Lake, Michigan, which, as the name suggests, is a town that's like right next to a lake. But like, man, good luck to you if you want to like find a place to like actually walk into the lake, without trespassing on someone's property. You have to drive a long time, to get to the one tiny little bit of public beach where the water's like a foot deep. That's so by definition, property is about asserting at least the threat of force to stop people from using something. Like that's what property is, that you're asserting a right to exclusively use something. And if you're not going to enforce it, it's not worth very much. Certainly what do property rights mean when it comes to like squatters and unoccupied buildings? Presumably it means using coercion, whether public coercion through the police or private security or whatever to enforce property rights. And sophisticated libertarians like understand this, and they will, when you press them, be very careful about it. They won't say, okay, no, we're not really talking about violence exactly, right, as what we're objecting to. We're not talking about, force or coercion in the ordinary sense of that term, which is like, pointing a gun at someone, as a use of force, or, saying, if you don't do what I say, I'll call some state authorities to come enforce it. What they're really talking about is aggression, but then when they get around to telling you what that means, as Matt Brunig famously points out, it gets very circular very quickly, because whether something counts as aggression or not ultimately boils down to whether you have a legitimate property claim or not. And at that point, we're just arguing about what the distribution of resources should be, which is like, well, if that's what we're arguing about, like we should have just started there and not gone down this rabbit hole of what, of force and violence and coercion.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I guess I'll just end with this point, and then Victor can have the last word, or maybe Ben, if you want to respond to both the things. But I'm just going to say that there are two kinds of libertarians that I encounter online. There's the good sophisticated libertarian, and then there's the anti-woke libertarian. And what I've noticed about the anti-woke libertarian is they're not actually all that libertarian, right? Generally speaking, they tend to associate with libertarianism or classical liberalism, typically for a while. This is the Stefan Molyneux type crowd, and I'd also throw in Ludwig von Mises and Ayn Rand as more sophisticated, but not by much, kind of expositors of this position. And what you find if you actually delve into their arguments is that they aren't actually committed very deeply to even the classical liberal liberties. What they're committed to is this idea that people need to be sorted hierarchically in terms of superior and inferior. And the reason they like the market is they see the market as being able to accomplish this. But if you start to see things, and this is what you're starting to see with the Republicans right now, like woke capitalism, for example, what's quite striking is a lot of these libertarians will very quickly change their gear a little bit and start talking about why we need the state to actually undertake aggressive action in order to recreate the hierarchy that they feel is appropriate. So if not capitalism, then it needs to be something else. Okay. And a lot of people I see online who kind of ascribe to libertarianism seem to hold these beliefs. I don't think they're really legit. What I do like about this book is Brennan does seem to me to at least be a principled libertarian, right? He's willing to bite the bullet and says we have this deontological commitment to liberty, a certain kind of radical equality and property rights, and we need to stand by it, not no matter what, because he does include some qualifications, but pretty consistently, right? That includes things like no social restrictions on most kinds of actions, open borders, not going to war, and I'll give him a lot of credit for that. What I don't like about this book is, again, and I think Ben talked about this, the prioritization of certain kinds of freedom over others. And with Paul Graham and Victor, I agree that we shouldn't just prioritize freedom. I think there are other things that we have reason to value. But even if we are just going to prioritize freedom, I think it's important to ask what that means. And I think libertarianism does a good job of accounting for our desire for negative liberty, and to a certain extent our desire for positive liberty. But what it really doesn't care very much about, and Brennan is just a spectacular example of that, is social liberty, or civic freedom, as it's sometimes called, right? The right to be governed by a set of laws and institutions that I myself have a say in, right? And this, of course, is a conception of liberty that goes back to the ancient Greeks, and it's something that I can't think of any serious libertarian thinker who actually prioritizes it, precisely because they know, circa Ben, that if we have the option of trying to decide what kind of institutional arrangement we truly desire, we might not actually choose to have a organization of property rights and entitlements that conforms to what libertarians wish. And where this potential starts to arise, you'll see them very quickly start to turn against democracy and civic freedom. And I say that because, of course, that's the title of Brennan's most famous book, right? Against Democracy, where he makes this argument abundantly clear, right? That we do not need to have civic freedom if that's going to challenge my conception of the kinds of freedom that I feel we have reason to prioritize. Absolutely. So for our listeners, you can read this book and the argument is put forward there. I think it's put forward a lot more elaboration in Against Democracy. But what's worth noting about it, even in that book, is that he doesn't really have a good answer to this issue of civic freedom or social freedom, however you want to call it. He basically just says, well, participating in government, it's such a small freedom. You have such a little say. Voting doesn't really matter all that much, and most people don't vote anyway. So there's no real reason we should prioritize it all that much. To which I respond, no, that actually goes to demonstrate how impoverished a lot of our democratic institutions are. And it's why we need to make sure that civic freedom gets a big comeback, both at the state level and also preferably in the workplace.
Also, by the way, I mean, he cares passionately about freedom to own the means of production, and a hell of a lot fewer people do that than vote.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well put that.
Yeah, that's he actually said, he also said, I think he calls like a concern with civic freedom or democracy, I think he calls it like romantic or something. He's like, it's a romantic thing that like, I don't see any intrinsic good in like expressing your democratic will. But I did want to end quickly just to kind of emphasize what I think is like my takeaway, or at least an important takeaway, is like the tension, as we've been talking about it, between his kind of like deontological attachment to freedom, but then also his commitment to social justice. And I think like, you know, if he's true to his word, I think, because as I read earlier from question 78, right, he says a just society has institutions that ensure as much as possible that everyone has the resources needed to be a free person. So like he kind of commits himself to this. He says that's the view he ascribes to neoclassical liberals, what he says he is. And then I guess it would be interesting to see whether if he was confronted with empirical evidence to show that like the libertarian society would not create those institutions, then that would, I guess, reveal like to what extent he's actually more of the engine of his view is from the deontological libertarian view, or whether it's from this kind of more consequentialist concern with social justice. And, you know, and I would say, like, I mean, for myself as a leftist, like, I really feel like a lot of my motivation comes from these empirical questions about what's actually going to create these institutions that I agree with the way he phrases it, even, that is going to make sure everyone can exercise their freedom in a meaningful way. And of course, I would also say that should include civic freedom. And so I would agree with Matt. So, you know, I would probably, if I saw evidence that, like, I don't know, minimum wage or whatever, and I know he has a chapter about, or talks about it briefly, actually created bad outcomes, I mean, I would change my position on that. So it would be interesting to know whether he would actually change his position if he was confronted with such analogous evidence.
Well, we'll leave that as an open question, since Brennan's not that old, so I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot more of him over the years. So anyway, for our listeners at the Pill Pod who are interested, again, you can check out Brennan's book, Libertarianism, What Everyone Needs to Know. Honestly, it's only, I think, like 150 short pages. You can get through it in an afternoon or two. Just pour yourself a big pot of coffee. Not badly written. We have a lot of problems with it, as you've heard. But, you know, readable book. Okay.
Stefan Molyneux, you should read it, because it's...
yeah. All you know, libertarian bros out there, take a look at this if you want some of the real deal. You might decide to convert pretty fucking quickly. Anyway, also, thanks a lot for coming on the show again, Ben. It's always great to have you. And I'm sure we'll be seeing you again in the future.
Sounds good.
Yep.